SMS Von Der Tann was the first battlecruiser of the German Navy, after something of a false start. You see, the British had kept the exact details of their new Invincible class Dreadnought armoured cruiser well under wraps, and since Dreadnought herself had taken the existing largest guns of battleships and made a ship with a single battery exclusively of these weapons, German thinking, and indeed most commentators of the time, thought that this principle would apply to the new British cruisers as well, taking the 9.2-inch gun, which was the largest gun on British armoured cruisers at the time, and making it the sole main battery weapon instead of the mix of 7.5 and 9.2-inch guns on previous classes. And so the Germans had designed the Blücher, an armoured cruiser, using a single main battery of their own 8.2-inch guns. This was to be their response to the incoming Invincible class. Then it turned out that the British had in fact stuck battleship-grade firepower on an armoured cruiser hull, and Blücher was now horrifically outgunned. So it was a quick journey back to the drawing board, but it was too late, by a matter of days, to change Blücher's design. But Cruiser F, the next year's ship, could be altered. Opinion was split, with Admiral von Tirpitz favouring following the British pattern of an overgrown cruiser killer, which changed little in terms of protection but maximised speed and firepower. However, a number of other naval designers recognised that the High Seas Fleet would be outnumbered, and thus concluded that if a ship was to carry battleship-grade firepower, it should be capable of fighting in the battle line as well, at least to a degree, and therefore armour should be increased to provide a degree of survivability. The Kaiser ended up siding with the latter group. For economic reasons, it was decided to use an improved 11-inch twin turret as the basis of the main battery, although 12-inch guns were considered initially, with the overall primary armament decided to be consisting of 8 11-inch guns, with initial design somewhat unsure of whether this should be in 2 twin and 4 single turrets, or 4 twin turrets, or even 3 twin and 2 single turrets. That there should be 1 twin turret forward and 1 aft was never questioned, but at first the designs called for mirrored positions on the wing turrets, and only later would it change to 1 on either wing in echelon, thus giving a theoretical 8-gun broadside. But much like the Invincibles, which had a similar turret layout, at most angles a 6-gun broadside was more likely, albeit that on the Von Der Tann the 8-gun firing arcs were somewhat wider than the British design. The secondary battery consisted of 10 casement-mounted 150mm or 5.9-inch guns, with, unusually for a Dreadnought-era ship, a tertiary battery of 16 single 88mm guns, reflecting the ship's design goal of fighting in an enemy fleet screen that might consist of everything from destroyers and torpedo boats all the way up to battlecruisers. 4 single underwater torpedo tubes were also included, with 1 pointing in each direction. Various arguments over the size of the main and secondary batteries after this design decision was taken generally went nowhere, thus avoiding a near repeat of the Blücher. The ship's armour protection was something of a halfway house. It was incredibly heavy for a cruiser, but it was also somewhat on the lighter side of things for a battleship. The main belt was 9.8 inches thick, trending down to between 3 and 4 inches at the bow and stern, in keeping with the distributed armour layout prevalent at the time in all navies. There was also a 2-inch thick sloped deck incorporated, and as a coal-fired ship, the bunkers were positioned to offer some additional defence, at least while they were full. Recognising that there was indeed a need for speed, Von Der Tann would use turbine engines instead of vertical triple expansion units. These drove 4 shafts with a designed power output of about 42,000 shaft horsepower and a design top speed of just under 25 knots. On trials, the machinery was actually able to kick the ship up to almost 28 knots with a considerably higher power output. Albeit that these figures should be taken with a little bit of caution, as German battlecruiser trials tended to run the ship light, with specialised propellers, in shallow water, with hand-picked engineering crews and specially selected good quality coal. In practical service, when loaded for war, and with a more typical lower quality German fuel coal aboard, speed capability tended to edge a little bit closer to the original design estimates, a problem that persisted across the entire High Seas Fleet, and would later be partially remedied by retrofitting oil spraying into the power plant. although they would still manage to exceed their design speed in regular service, just not by quite as much. Von der Tann would be laid down in March 1908 and launched a day short of a year later in 1909, and would then commission into the fleet in September 1910. As with many early German dreadnought-era capital ships, there were some issues with rolling discovered on trials, which would eventually result in the fitting of bilge keels to supplement the anti-roll tanks. Trials also demonstrated that the gun's range on all batteries was somewhat less than satisfactory given the ranges that were being achieved by their likely opponents, and over time these issues would be addressed by increasing the maximum elevation of the primary and secondary guns, thereby increasing the range. Her pre-war duties consisted largely of acting as a giant floating billboard for the German shipbuilding industry, as she was fast, well armed, and reasonably well protected. But with the delay in German battlecruiser development caused by the false start that was represented by Blücher, by the time she was actually in service, naval technology and design had already moved on, so she would remain a one-off ship, succeeded by the Moltke class. Her first action during the war was an unsuccessful attempt to assist German forces at the First Battle of Heligoland Bight. She was ready to go, but was held up by a low tide in the Jade Estuary, which meant she couldn't actually leave until it was too late to engage the British battlecruisers. She would subsequently take part in a series of raids on the British North Sea coast, first Yarmouth, then Scarborough and Whitby, and in the latter case narrowly avoiding a clash with British battlecruisers. She would then be in refit when the next attempted raid resulted in the Battle of Dogger Bank. She was replaced in the German battle line with Blücher, which was then sunk in the engagement. Following the refit's completion, she took part in operations against Russian forces in the Baltic Sea, which included a couple of duels with Russian armoured cruisers and their escorts, from which she emerged with cosmetic damage only, validating that aspect of her design. One last raid, this time on Yarmouth and Lowestoft, preceded her greatest action, taking part in the Battle of Jutland. Von der Tann started out well at the Battle of Jutland, duelling with HMS Indefatigable and scoring a number of hits, one of which struck the forward turret, setting off a chain reaction which saw the ship torn apart by a catastrophic magazine detonation within about 30 seconds. The first of several such occurrences that day. She would then come under fire from the Queen Elizabeth-class ships of the 5th Battle Squadron, taking a hit which damaged her steering gear, and only rapid action by her crew saved this from becoming a fatal circle back into the waiting guns of the British battleships. The reprieve was not without cost, as the most unlikely of ships to score a hit on anything, HMS Tiger, actually managed to score a couple of hits on Von der Tann, disabling 2 main battery turrets in quick succession, although the fires started by these hits obscured the ship enough that New Zealand, which had also been shooting at her, decided to shoot at Moltke instead. With a couple of turrets still able to fire, Von der Tann blazed away at HMS Barham, and then at New Zealand, but with limited effectiveness due to only usually being able to bring one working turret to bear, until this also jammed, leaving her without an operational main armament. Nevertheless, the captain elected to remain in line as a fire magnet to draw enemy shells away from other operational vessels, and he was able to evade much more effectively now that he didn't have to worry about disrupting a firing solution. As darkness began to fall, one of the turrets came back online, only for HMS Revenge to land a hit on the aft conning tower that killed or wounded everyone inside, including the rangefinder operators, and knocking out the ship's internal lighting via splinters. 2 more turrets were working again by 2100 hours, but would then break down again. The forward turret remained stubbornly out of action the entire time. Due to issues with the quality of her coal, Von der Tann was forced to drop out of the battlecruiser line and join up with the pre-dreadnoughts that were left of Admiral Mauve's 2nd Squadron, narrowly avoiding a torpedo from a British destroyer before 1st Scouting Group was ordered to retire from the action. After a couple of months of repairs, she would then take part in a number of raids in the latter part of 1916, but without much result, before settling in with much of the rest of the German capital ship fleet into a state of relative inaction during the latter part of the war. When orders were issued for a final action at the end of 1918 against the Grand Fleet, a significant number of crew simply deserted, and along with other unrest and mutiny, forced the operation to be cancelled. Instead, along with most of the High Seas Fleet, she would be interred in Scapa Flow, where her crew took over running the ship from the officers for most of the time, much of the social discontent having not been adequately resolved. Along with the rest of the High Seas Fleet in Scapa, Von Der Tann would be scuttled on the 21st of June 1919, with the wreck being salvaged in 1930 and scrapped over the following few years.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.